The Renaissance gave the world some of the most beautiful things human hands have ever made. That much is not in dispute. The paintings hanging in the great galleries of Florence and Rome, the architecture that still stops people cold in the street, the philosophy that restructured how the Western world thought about itself, all of it real, all of it extraordinary, all of it still standing. What we inherit from that century of Italian genius is, by any honest measure, magnificent, and every last piece of it was paid for. Not by the muses, not by some impersonal flowering of the human spirit, but by a small interlocking network of merchant families and papal financiers in 14th and 15th century Italy who had very specific political needs and who discovered that beauty, wielded correctly, was the most durable instrument of power ever devised. The art was real. The genius was real. The patronage behind it was calculated. And the question worth asking, the question this story is built around, is what it means that the most transcendent cultural achievement in Western history was also, at its foundations, a project. Not despite that fact, because of it. Italy in the late 13th century was not a country. It was a collection of competing city-states strung down a peninsula, each with its own government, its own currency, its own army, and its own enemies. Milan sat in the north under the ambitions of whoever held it that season. Venice ran itself as a merchant republic, ice-cold and precise, its oligarchs counting money from a city built on mud and water. Florence controlled the wool trade and the roads through Tuscany. Rome was a wreck of ancient stone and papal politics. Naples answered to a foreign dynasty. There was no common authority, no shared allegiance beyond the church, and even that was fracturing. This was the world into which the Renaissance was born, not a garden, but a battleground. Florence in the 1250s had minted a coin that would reshape the world. The florin was gold, reliable, and trusted, from London to Constantinople. Every merchant who handled one knew its weight without checking. International trade ran on it. Papal finances ran on it. The armies of French kings were paid in it. A city of perhaps 90,000 people, densely packed along the Arno, had become the financial capital of the Western world, and the men who ran that city knew exactly what that meant. Money was power, and power required management. The merchant families of Florence were not simply wealthy. They were structurally indispensable to everyone who mattered. The great banking houses of the 13th and early 14th centuries, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli, operated at a scale that had no precedent in medieval Europe. They financed the papacy. They financed the English crown. They had branch offices across the continent, a network of agents, a system of credit instruments that made the physical transport of gold unnecessary. When a wool merchant in England needed to pay a supplier in Bruges, a Florentine banker in London issued a letter, and a Florentine banker in Bruges settled the debt. The transaction passed through Florence without a single coin moving. The men who ran this system understood leverage long before anyone had a word for it. Then, within a generation, almost all of it collapsed. King Edward III of England stopped paying his debts to the Bardi and Peruzzi in the 1340s. A European-wide recession had already been cutting into margins. The Peruzzi company collapsed in 1343. The Acciaiuoli fell the same year. The Bardi followed in 1346. Fortunes that had taken a century to build were gone in a decade. Florence, which had styled itself the financial center of Christendom, watched its greatest institutions dissolve. The men who had run those institutions did not disappear. They looked for new ground and new instruments. The crisis that destroyed the first generation of Florentine banking created the conditions for the second. 2 years after the Bardi collapsed, the plague arrived. In March of 1348, the Black Death entered Florence, and within months, the city lost half its population. Florence had held roughly 100,000 people before the plague. By the summer of 1348, it held perhaps 50,000. Streets that had been loud with commerce went silent. Priests died before they could administer last rites. Notaries died before they could record wills. The city's administration effectively stopped functioning. Bodies were collected by the poorest men willing to do it, thrown into mass graves and covered with lime. The smell settled over the city like weather. Giovanni Boccaccio was in Florence that summer. He was 35 years old, already known as a writer, and what he witnessed became the frame of the Decameron. 10 young people who retreat to a villa outside the city to escape the dying and tell each other stories to pass the days. The plague in Boccaccio's account is rendered with a precision that reads less like literature than like testimony. People abandoned their sick relatives. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid each other. Animals that touched the clothing of the dead fell over within hours. Boccaccio wrote it all down, and what he was writing, without naming it that, was the end of one world and the first breath of another. The plague did not only kill people, it killed the assumptions those people had lived by. The Church, which had spent 2 centuries constructing itself as the mediator between humanity and death, had no answer for the Black Death. See, priests died alongside sinners. Prayer did not help. The sacraments did not help. The elaborate theological architecture of the late medieval church, the indulgences, the relics, the carefully ordered cosmology, had promised a framework for suffering, and in the summer of 1348, that framework failed publicly and catastrophically. Among the survivors, the question of what the Church was actually for became genuinely open for the first time in centuries. The plague did not come once. It returned to Florence and the Italian peninsula in 1361, 1363, 1371, 1374, and again in the 1380s and 1390s. Each wave killed fewer than the first. Populations had partly contracted to a more sustainable level, but each wave reminded the living of their exposure. The consequence, over the second half of the 14th century, was not despair, but a peculiar intensity about the present. Survivors inherited. Survivors accumulated. A city of 50,000 people had the property and the commercial infrastructure of a city of 100,000. The survivors of the Black Death were, on average, richer than their parents had been. The papacy offered no stability during these decades. In 1309, the papal court had relocated from Rome to Avignon in southern France, where it remained for nearly 70 years under 7 successive French popes, all operating under the close influence of the French crown. To Italians, this was humiliation dressed in theology. The seat of Christendom had become a dependency of the French king. Petrarch, who grew up near Avignon and knew its court from the inside, called it the Babylonian captivity of the Church. The phrase landed hard because it was precise. The papacy had been captured, and everyone could see it. When Pope Gregory XI finally returned the papal court to Rome in 1377, the relief lasted barely a year. Gregory died in 1378, and the conclave that followed produced 2 popes simultaneously, Urban VI in Rome, Clement VII in Avignon, each declaring the other illegitimate, each excommunicating the other's supporters, each controlling separate administrative machineries, each demanding financial obedience from the Catholic kingdoms of Europe. The Western Schism lasted until 1417. For nearly 4 decades, the institution that claimed to speak for God on earth could not agree on who spoke for it. The damage to papal authority was permanent. Into this vacuum moved the city-states. With no effective emperor and no credible papacy, political authority in Italy was genuinely up for grabs, and the men who held it were almost always men who had made money first. Milan fell to the Visconti family, ruthless military rulers who controlled northern trade routes. Venice tightened its oligarchic grip and expanded eastward. Florence, having survived the banking collapse and the plague, reorganized under its merchant guilds and began looking for ways to stabilize what remained. The commercial revolution had created wealth. The political vacuum created the opportunity to convert that wealth into something more durable than money. Florence's political structure in the late 14th century was formally a republic, run through a system of guilds and rotating councils that preserved the appearance of popular governance. In practice, power moved through networks of alliance, debt, and favor. The wealthiest families did not hold formal office so much as they controlled who did. Cosimo de' Medici's father, Giovanni, would begin building the family's banking operation in the early 1400s. Not the first great Florentine bank, but the one that would survive. And the key to survival was understanding that banking and politics were not separate activities. They were the same activity conducted through different instruments. Francesco Petrarch had died in 1374, the year before the schism. He left behind a body of work that pointed somewhere new. Petrarch had spent his life collecting and studying the manuscripts of ancient Rome, Cicero above all, and had concluded that his own age was a period of darkness compared to classical antiquity. His letters, written in the crisp Latin he had recovered from Roman models rather than the cluttered Latin of medieval scholars, argued that the past contained a kind of excellence that the present had lost and might recover. He was the first person to name the Middle Centuries as a dark age and to treat the ancient world as a standard to which the living might aspire. He had no idea what he was setting in motion. Giotto di Bondone had died in 1337, just before the plague. He had spent his career painting figures that looked like people with weight, with shadow, with grief on their faces that you recognized because you had seen it on the faces of the living. The flat, gilded saints of Byzantine tradition had given way, in Giotto's hands, to men and women who occupied space. His figures stood on ground. They cast shadows. They reached toward each other with arms that had muscle in them. Boccaccio wrote that Giotto's paintings were so lifelike that viewers could mistake them for the real thing. That was not hyperbole. It was a description of an entirely new visual proposition, that art could capture the world as it was, not as theology required it to be. The Florentine vernacular had also done something no one had quite planned. Dante's Divine Comedy, finished in the 1320s, was written not in Latin but in the Tuscan dialect, and because Dante was Dante, the Tuscan dialect became, over the following generations, the default literary language of the Italian peninsula. What Dante had created, a poem of such ambition and precision that it required a new kind of Italian to contain it, established Florence as the center of Italian literary culture in a way that no political act could have engineered. The city produced language that the whole peninsula adopted. That was a form of power, and the families who ran Florence were not slow to notice. By the end of the 14th century, the ground had been prepared, though no one at the time would have described it that way. The plague had redistributed wealth and shattered institutional certainty. The schism had delegitimized the church as a moral authority. The collapse of the first banking generation had cleared space for new financial architectures. What Petrarch had established the intellectual proposition that classical antiquity was a lost world worth recovering. Giotto had established the visual proposition that reality, honestly observed, was a legitimate subject for art. And Florence, battered and resilient, still sat at the center of European finance, a city that had survived everything and was looking, as it always had, for the next advantage. The standard story of the Renaissance begins with genius. It begins with beautiful things appearing, as if the culture had simply been waiting for the right conditions and then flowered. What that story omits is everything that came before the flowering. The wars, the collapses, the plagues, the institutional failures, the power vacuums, and the very specific ambitions of very specific men who understood that something enormous was possible if you moved quickly enough and were willing to spend money to shape it. The Renaissance did not emerge from peace and stability. It emerged from crisis. That is the first thing you need to understand about it. You are standing in Florence in the year 1400. The city is quieter than it was 50 years ago, though it is rebuilding. You can see the unfinished cathedral against the sky, the great dome still missing, the problem of how to span it unsolved, though a solution is coming. The streets smell of wool and river water. The money changers are back at their benches in the market. A new generation of merchants is counting its inheritance and making plans. The plague taught them something their parents and grandparents could not have known from prosperity alone. That everything is contingent, that the world can change completely within a season, and that the men who are ready when it does are the ones who matter. They are ready. Giovanni de Bicci de' Medici was not born rich. His father died when he was 3, leaving an inheritance divided among 5 sons that left each of them with very little. He grew up watching his uncle Vieri run one of the 70-odd banking operations scattered across Florence in the second half of the 14th century. And he paid attention. He worked his way up through Vieri's Rome branch, learned the mechanics of papal finance from the inside, and when Vieri retired in 1393, Giovanni took what remained of the operation and made it his own. In 1397, he moved the headquarters to Florence and opened what would become the most consequential bank in the history of Western Europe. He started with roughly 10,000 gold florins and 17 employees. The Renaissance, though no one knew it yet, had found its banker. The church prohibited usury. Charging interest on a loan was a mortal sin, the kind that sent men to hell with money bags hung around their necks, a punishment Dante had described vividly in the Inferno, which was still well within living cultural memory in 1397. The Florentine banking community had spent the previous century working out how to make money without technically violating this prohibition, and the instrument they had perfected was the bill of exchange. A merchant who needed funds in London did not borrow money from the Medici. He sold them a bill, a written order to be redeemed in a different city, in a different currency, at a future date. The profit was embedded in the exchange rate. The church called it commerce. The bankers called it commerce. Everyone understood it was interest, and everyone kept moving. The mechanics of the bill of exchange gave the Medici something more powerful than profit. They gave them reach. A wool merchant in Florence could hand a Medici agent a bill drawn on London, and 90 days later, a Medici agent in London would settle the account in sterling. No gold moved, no convoy crossed the Alps under armed guard, no robbery on the road between Milan and Lyon. The transaction was paper, and the paper was trusted because the Medici name was trusted. In a world where physical transport of money was slow, dangerous, and expensive, the ability to move value across the continent through a network of agents and letters was a form of infrastructure. The Medici did not just lend money, they were the roads. The great insight of Giovanni di Bicci was strategic rather than technical. The Bardi and Peruzzi had collapsed because they lent too heavily to monarchs, to the kings of England and Naples, and monarchs, when they ran short, simply stopped paying. Giovanni had watched that catastrophe reshape his city's entire commercial class. He drew the lesson hard. The church was a better client than any king. The papacy needed to move money constantly, collecting revenue from dioceses across Europe, paying officials, financing wars, managing estates in a dozen countries. The institution that handled those transactions received a share of every one of them, and the papacy, unlike Edward III, had both the will and the structural need to pay its debts. Giovanni positioned the Medici Bank to become indispensable to the papal treasury. The opportunity came through the chaos of the Western Schism. Baldassare Cosa was one of the men claiming the papacy, operating as John XXIII from 1410, and he needed banking support that the fractured, warring papal factions could not organize internally. Giovanni backed Cosa, and Cosa appointed the Medici as managers of the full papal treasury. The Rome branches of the Medici Bank, handling apostolic revenues from across the continent, soon accounted for well over half the bank's total profits. When the Council of Constance deposed Cosa in 1415 and the Medici temporarily lost the papal account, Giovanni paid the deposed antipope's ransom, 35,000 florins, but nearly half of what the bank had earned in its first 20 years, out of loyalty and out of calculation. The gesture was remembered. When a single recognized pope finally emerged in Martin V, the Medici were his bankers. Giovanni de Bicci built the bank on a structural insight that the previous generation had missed. A banking house should be organized not as a single entity, but as a constellation of legally distinct partnerships, each branch operating under its own agreement while the parent company in Florence held the largest stake. If the London branch failed, the London branch failed. The Florence operation was protected. The Venice branch could be isolated from the Geneva branch. The architecture was deliberately fragile at the margins and robust at the core. And it kept the Medici solvent through crises that would have destroyed a more conventionally structured institution. By 1402, branches existed in Venice and Rome. By the 1440s, the network ran from London to Bruges, from Avignon to Milan, from Geneva to Naples. The Medici Bank was not a bank. It was a continent. Giovanni de Bicci also kept quiet. Florence was formerly a republic, governed by rotating councils drawn from its major guilds, and the city's civic culture was intensely, almost anxiously proud of its republican tradition. Visible power attracted rivals, attracted scrutiny, attracted the kind of factional hostility that had destroyed families before the Medici were born. Giovanni gave money to popular causes, supported tax reform that benefited the middle classes, and avoided making enemies he did not need to make. He accumulated political influence without accumulating political profile. When he died in 1429, he was the second wealthiest man in Florence, and had made himself beloved by people who had no clear sense of how powerful he actually was. His son Cosimo was a different instrument entirely. He had grown up watching his father work, had traveled to the Council of Constance as a young man, and seen the full machinery of European politics close up. The competing papal claimants, the German emperor, the French cardinals, the money-changing hands beneath every theological argument. He understood, viscerally and precisely, that finance and politics were not adjacent activities. They were the same activity. When he took over the bank in 1429, he expanded the branch network, deepened the papal relationship, and began investing in Florentine political life with the same systematic patience his father had used to build the banking operation, discreetly, relationally, through networks of obligation and favor that were invisible from the outside and unmistakable from within. In 1433, the old Florentine oligarchy moved against him. The Albizzi family, who had watched the Medici accumulate influence for 30 years, had Cosimo arrested and charged with the capital crime of seeking to elevate himself above other citizens. They intended to execute him. What happened instead illuminated exactly what kind of power the Medici had built. The jailer was persuaded to taste Cosimo's food before him in case of poison. The gonfalonier, the head of Florence's justice system, was softened by what the sources describe as gold-bearing mules, while the death sentence became exile. Cosimo left Florence for Venice, where he was received like a sovereign, and he took his bank with him. Capital followed him. Within a year, the flight of money from Florence was so severe that the exile order had to be lifted. He returned in 1434. His rivals were banished, and they did not come back. For the next 30 years, Cosimo ran Florence without holding formal office, without declaring himself its ruler, without dismantling the republic's institutional architecture. He controlled who held office. He decided peace and war. The Bishop of Siena, who later became Pope Pius II, described the arrangement plainly. Political questions were settled in Cosimo's house, and the man he chose held office. He was king in all but name. The republic's forms remained intact. They were the costume the power wore in public. The Medici were not alone in this kind of operation. The Pazzi family ran a competing banking network with its own papal connections and its own political ambitions. The Strozzi built their fortune in textiles and international trade, and would eventually construct what remained for a century the largest private palace in Florence. The Albizzi, before their fall, had run the city for a generation. The Tornabuoni were bound to the Medici through marriage and money. Florence in the mid-15th century was a city of perhaps 40 to 50,000 people, in which perhaps 10 or 15 families controlled the significant movements of wealth and power, and those families were interlocked through debt, kinship, shared business interests, and the constant, delicate management of honor. The patronage of churches, of scholars, of artists was how these families signaled their standing to each other. The florin underpinned all of it. It had been in circulation since 1252, reliably gold, reliably weighted, trusted across 2 centuries of political upheaval. When you held a florin, you held something that a merchant in London and a merchant in Cairo both recognized as real money. Florence had built that trust through consistent minting standards maintained across generations of political turbulence, and the trust in the coin reflected back as trust in the city and trust in the institutions the city produced. The Medici Bank's letters of credit were accepted across Europe, partly because the florin behind them was accepted across Europe. Nah, you cannot build a propaganda infrastructure without first building a financial infrastructure. The money came first. Giovanni de' Bicci had one patron's gesture to his name. He commissioned the bronze doors of the Florence Baptistery competition in 1401, which produced Lorenzo Ghiberti's famous panels. It was a civic act, the kind of thing a wealthy Florentine did to honor his city and manage his reputation. His son Cosimo began doing it systematically. In 1419, he committed to financing the reconstruction of the Basilica of San Lorenzo, and by 1442 he had taken over complete funding of the project, insisting that no family crest other than the Medici appear anywhere on the building. He built the first public library in Florence, stocked with manuscripts he had agents hunting across Europe. He commissioned Donatello. He financed Fra Angelico. He rebuilt the convent of San Marco. He spent money on beauty the way his father had spent money on the papacy, as investment, as infrastructure, as the construction of a position from which power could be exercised without being named. The church prohibition on usury had one other consequence that shaped everything that followed. Because the Florentine bankers could not openly charge interest, they needed instruments that disguised their profits, and those instruments absolutely required, a network of agents in multiple cities who trusted each other, maintained accounts, and handled the settlement of bills. That network, built over a century to serve as financial transactions, was the same network through which manuscripts traveled, through which scholars were recommended, through which the physical objects of classical antiquity moved from one collection to another across the continent. The infrastructure of Renaissance culture ran on the infrastructure of Renaissance banking. The roads were the same roads. By the time Cosimo de' Medici died in 1464, the Medici Bank had branches in 8 cities outside Florence, controlled the papal financial accounts, held a monopoly on the mining of alum, the mineral essential to dyeing cloth, without which the textile industry could not function, and had financed the political careers of a generation of Florentine office holders. The bank's assets had grown from 10,000 florins in 1397 to something that contemporaries struggled to accurately calculate, partly because the Medici kept 2 sets of books, one for the tax authorities and one recording actual profits. The city had named Cosimo Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, a title borrowed from ancient Rome. The man who chose Florence's leaders, decided its wars, and controlled its financial arteries had arranged to be thanked for it. He had also, by 1464, begun spending money on something that would outlast the bank, outlast the family, and outlast the republic itself. He had begun building the intellectual architecture of a new world. You are in the counting house of the Medici Bank on Via Porta Rossa in Florence in 1450. The room smells of ink and beeswax. A clerk enters figures into a ledger using double-entry notation, every debit matched by a credit, every transaction balanced against its counterpart in a branch city hundreds of miles away. The numbers in this room are connected, through a chain of letters and agents, to numbers in rooms in London, Bruges, Venice, Rome, and Avignon. Nothing large happens in Europe, no war, no papal election, no royal marriage, no cathedral construction, without passing through a transaction that ends up, at some remove, as an entry in a ledger like this one. The bank is not a building. The bank is a web, and Florence is its center, and the men who run it are only beginning to understand what that position allows them to build. The other families watched. The Pazzi were ambitious and capable and had their own networks and their own papal connections, and they would eventually decide that the Medici had accumulated too much. The Strozzi watched from their palace across the river and counted their own money and waited. Every wealthy family in Florence understood that patronage was not charity. It was positioning. It was competition. It was the public language of a private power struggle conducted through beauty. The Medici were simply better at it than anyone else. They spent more, they planned further ahead, and they had in Cosimo and then in his grandson Lorenzo 2 men of genuine intellectual seriousness who understood that the ideas being purchased mattered as much as the art, and that the art and the ideas together could do something that money alone could never accomplish. They could make power look like destiny. The money architecture was in place, the papal connection was secure, The branch network spanned the continent. The family had demonstrated, through Cosimo's exile and return, that they could survive political crisis because their wealth was mobile and their networks were deep. What remained was the question of legitimacy, not legal legitimacy, which Florence's Republican forms provided, but the deeper kind, the kind that makes power feel not just tolerated, but deserved, not just effective, but right. That question required a different kind of investment. It required scholars, philosophers, artists, and a body of ideas so beautiful and so ancient that it would make the men who promoted it look not like bankers who had gotten lucky in a power vacuum, but like the natural heirs of the greatest civilization the world had ever produced. That project was about to begin. In the spring of 1397, a man arrived in Florence who had sailed from Constantinople carrying something the city had never had. His name was Manuel Chrysoloras, and he was a Byzantine scholar and diplomat sent westward by the Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos to seek military support against the Ottomans pressing on the empire from every side. He came as an ambassador. He left as something more consequential. Coluccio Salutati, the Chancellor of Florence, had arranged a position for him at the city's university, the first professorship of Greek ever established in Western Europe. When the news of his imminent arrival circulated through Salutati's circle of humanists, one of them wrote that a new god was coming. That was not rhetoric. For men who had spent their careers straining to understand the ancient world through imperfect Latin translations, the arrival of a man who had grown up reading Homer and Plato in the original was the closest thing to a resurrection they could imagine. When Chrysoloras taught in Florence from 1397 to 1400, he worked from scratch. There was no Greek grammar available in the Latin West. He wrote one himself, setting out the declensions in a question-and-answer format that his students could follow. He translated portions of Homer's Odyssey and Plato's Republic word for word into Latin so that beginners had a foothold in the language. His students included the men who would become the intellectual architects of the early Renaissance: Leonardo Bruni, who abandoned his law studies to attend the classes and later became the Chancellor of Florence; Guarino da Verona, who would spend the next 40 years teaching Greek across northern Italy; Niccolò Nicolai, who would accumulate the largest private manuscript collection in Florence; and a generation of others who went on to translate, teach, and spread Greek learning across the peninsula. Chrysoloras taught for 3 years and seeded a tradition that ran for a century. The Latin West had not lost Greek by accident. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the capacity to read Greek had narrowed steadily, confined to a handful of monasteries and the occasional scholar with access to Arab translations. By the 14th century, most of the Greek philosophical tradition reached Western thinkers through Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek originals, a chain of mediation that introduced errors, simplified concepts, and lost nuances at every step. What the Florentine humanists of Petrarch's generation admired as classical antiquity was almost entirely the Latin tradition. Cicero, Virgil, Livy, Tacitus. The Greek half of the classical world, Plato, Thucydides, Homer, the pre-Socratics, existed for them as names and rumors, texts they knew had existed but could not read. Aristotle was the exception. His works had come back into the Latin West through Arab intermediaries in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the medieval scholastic tradition had built its entire philosophical architecture around him. Thomas Aquinas had spent decades reconciling Aristotle with Christian theology. The universities of Europe ran on Aristotle: logic, natural philosophy, metaphysics, all of it filtered through a single ancient thinker whose works had survived intact. The result was a kind of intellectual monopoly. Aristotle had become the authorized version of ancient thought. What Chrysoloras brought with him was the rest of the library. What the Florentine humanists discovered when they finally got access to Plato was not simply a different philosopher. It was a different way of thinking about the world. Where Aristotle worked from observation, categorization, and logical demonstration, Plato worked from questions, long, spiraling dialogues that circled a problem without resolving it, that treated knowledge as a process rather than a product, and that proposed a universe in which the material world was a shadow of a higher, ideal reality. The Platonic worldview was more congenial to mysticism, to beauty, and to the kind of elevated, philosophically grounded theology that the Florentine humanists were looking for. It was also, the Medici would discover, considerably more useful as a political instrument than Aristotle's classroom logic. The Council of Florence met in 1438 and 1439, assembled at Cosimo de' Medici's direct instigation and expense. Its official purpose was to heal the schism between the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches, a theological unification that the Byzantine emperor desperately needed in order to secure Western military support against the Ottomans. Cosimo funded the logistics of bringing the Byzantine delegation to Florence, housing them, feeding them, keeping the council running. The theological negotiations ultimately failed. The Orthodox and Catholic churches did not reunite, but something else happened in Florence in those months that proved more durable than any ecumenical agreement. The Byzantine delegation included, alongside its bishops and theologians, an elderly philosopher named Georgios Gemistos Plethon. And Plethon was unlike anyone the Florentine intellectuals had ever encountered. Plethon was perhaps 80 years old by the time he reached Florence. He had spent his career at Mistra, in the Peloponnese, teaching philosophy in what remained of the Byzantine world's cultural life. He was not orthodox in any simple sense. His private writings, which he circulated only among close friends, revealed a philosophy that drew on Plato, Zoroaster, and the pre-Socratics in ways that moved well beyond Christian theology. In Florence, he set up an informal school, lecturing on the differences between Plato and Aristotle in a way that upended the assumptions his Italian audiences had carried for decades. Where the scholastic tradition treated Aristotle as definitive, Plethon argued that Plato was the superior philosopher, that Aristotle's system, however useful for natural inquiry, could not reach the highest truths about the soul, God, and the structure of reality. Marsilio Ficino later called Plethon the second Plato. Cardinal Bessarion speculated that Plato's own soul had entered him. Cosimo de' Medici attended Plethon's lectures. What exactly passed between an elderly Byzantine philosopher and the most powerful banker in Europe in those months in Florence in 1439 is not entirely recoverable. What is documented is the result. More than 20 years after the Council of Florence closed, Cosimo established a young man named Marsilio Ficino at a villa near his own estate at Careggi, outside the city, gave him Greek manuscripts of Plato and the Neoplatonists, provided him with a stipend, and instructed him to translate the complete works of Plato into Latin. No such complete translation existed anywhere in the Western world. Cosimo was creating one. The project was intellectual. It was also, as everything Cosimo did, strategic. Marsilio Ficino had grown up in Cosimo's household. His father was Cosimo's personal physician, and Cosimo had taken an interest in the boy's education from the beginning, effectively becoming his patron before Ficino was old enough to have done anything to earn it. Ficino was ordained a priest and spoke Latin with the precision of a man who had studied it since childhood. He had taught himself Greek under the tuition of a Byzantine scholar visiting Florence. When Cosimo gave him the villa at Careggi in 1462 and handed him the manuscripts, he was giving work to a man he had already shaped, a translator, a philosopher, and a Christian priest who could make Platonic philosophy not merely available to Latin readers, but compatible with Christian theology. That combination was not accidental. It was the precise tool Cosimo needed. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 changed the scale of what was already happening. On the 29th of May that year, Sultan Mehmed II's army broke through the Theodosian walls after a 53-day siege, and the city that had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years fell in a single day. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI died fighting on the walls. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque before nightfall. Mehmed rode through the ruined streets and recited Persian poetry in the emptied palace. The scholars who survived, The grammarians, philosophers, theologians, physicians, architects, musicians, and scribes who had kept Byzantine intellectual life alive, packed what they could carry and looked west. They came to Venice first, because Venice had the closest trading relationship with the Byzantine world and the largest established Greek community. By 1500, Venice held a Greek-speaking population of roughly 5,000 refugees, scholars, merchants, priests, and their children. They came to Florence because the Medici had money and a demonstrated appetite for manuscripts. They came to Rome because the papacy, whatever its political difficulties, still represented the largest institutional patronage network in Christendom. They arrived carrying manuscripts that the Latin West had not seen for centuries. Complete texts of Plato, Thucydides, Plutarch, Strabo, Ptolemy, and hundreds of other Greek authors, many of them surviving nowhere in Western Europe. What Constantinople had preserved through the Middle Ages was now, in the wreckage of its fall, distributed across the Italian peninsula. Cardinal Bessarion was the figure who turned this dispersal into a project. He had been one of the Byzantine delegates at the Council of Florence in 1439, had converted to Catholicism, been made a cardinal, and had spent the following decades in Rome building what amounted to a rescue operation for Greek intellectual heritage. He collected manuscripts systematically, employing agents, funding copyists, buying collections, accepting donations. By 1468, he had assembled over 500 Greek manuscripts, the largest such collection in Western Europe. He donated the entire library to Venice, where it became the foundation of the Bibliotheca Marciana. The gift preserved texts that might otherwise have been lost in private hands, scattered or destroyed. Bessarion understood that the fall of Constantinople had not ended the Greek tradition. It had displaced it, and displacement, if managed carefully, could become transmission. For the Medici, the flood of Greek scholars represented an extraordinary opportunity. These were men with no institutional base in Italy, no inherited wealth, no network of the kind that Florentine families had spent generations building. They had knowledge and they had manuscripts, and in the Florence of the mid-15th century, the knowledge and manuscripts were precisely what the Medici were buying. Cosimo had already established the first public library in Florence, stocked with manuscripts his agents had been hunting across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The arriving scholars could fill gaps in that collection, correct corrupt Latin translations against original Greek texts, teach the language to the next generation of Florentine humanists, and lend the Medici intellectual project the credential of genuine Byzantine learning, learning that reached back, unbroken, to Athens itself. The transaction was mutual, and it was understood to be mutual. A scholar who arrived in Florence penniless, carrying a manuscript collection and a knowledge of Greek that most Florentines did not have, needed a patron. He needed housing, income, access to a library, and the kind of social protection that only a powerful family could provide in a city where political conditions shifted quickly. The Medici provided all of those things. In return, the scholars gave the Medici something that money could not directly purchase: intellectual legitimacy. A banking family that supported genuine Greek scholarship, that funded the translation of Plato, that housed the men who had carried ancient learning out of the burning city. That family was not merely wealthy. It was the guardian of civilization. The propaganda value of that position was incalculable, and Cosimo understood it with the same clarity he brought to a bill of exchange. Ficino completed his translation of the complete works of Plato by around 1468, 28 dialogues rendered into clean, readable Latin for the first time in the history of Western Europe. The work was printed in 1484 and circulated across the continent. He went on to translate the Enneads of Plotinus, the Hermetic texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, Iamblichus, Porphyry, and the other Neoplatonists, the full philosophical heritage of late antiquity, brought into Latin and made available to any educated reader who could afford a printed book. The impact was immediate and irreversible. Philosophers and theologians across Europe who had spent their careers working with Aristotle now had access to a completely different intellectual world, one that suited the spiritual and aesthetic ambitions of the Renaissance, far better than Aristotle's careful categorizations had ever done. The Neoplatonic philosophy that Ficino transmitted was not politically neutral. It proposed a universe organized by love and beauty, ascending from material forms to ideal ones, with the human soul positioned at the center of a great chain of being that connected the earthly and the divine. It treated beauty as a path to God. It elevated the role of contemplation and the life of the mind, and it gave philosophical grounding to the idea that the artist or the philosopher who perceived and expressed beauty was engaged in a fundamentally spiritual act. For the Medici, whose project required transforming a banking dynasty into a dynasty of philosopher princes, this was not simply interesting philosophy. It was the ideological architecture of everything they were trying to build. Plato, through Ficino, gave the Renaissance its metaphysical backbone. The scholars in exile had not come to Florence to be instruments of Medici power. Platon had come to argue for church reunion and to talk about Plato because Plato was the thing he cared about most in the world. Ficino had devoted his life to making ancient philosophy available to his own age because he genuinely believed it contained truths Christianity needed. Bicci had assembled his library because he could not bear the thought of the texts being lost. Each of them had their own motivations, their own intellectual commitments, their own understanding of what they were doing. And each of them, in pursuing those commitments, served the Medici's purposes, not through deception, but through alignment. The Medici needed what the scholars had. The scholars needed what the Medici had. History does not always require conspiracy. Sometimes it requires only that the right interests find each other at the right moment. By the 1460s, Florence had something no other city in Europe possessed: a functioning Platonic academy, a working Greek library, a generation of humanists trained to read the original texts, and a patron family willing to spend whatever was necessary to keep the whole apparatus running. The manuscripts that Byzantine scholars had carried out of Constantinople were being translated, copied, taught, and debated in a Florentine villa while the greatest artists of the age worked in studios a few streets away. The scholars in exile had not found a refuge. They had found a workshop, and what was being built in it would change everything. There is a word that gets used about the Renaissance that deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives. The word is humanism, and by the 15th century it had a precise institutional meaning that its later reputation as a soft, inspirational philosophy tends to obscure. The Studia Humanitatis was a curriculum, 5 disciplines specifically: grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. It was taught in schools, universities, and private academies. Its purpose was to produce men who could read Latin and Greek with precision, write with elegance and force, argue a case before a court or a council, compose a speech that moved an audience, and understand the past well enough to navigate the present. What humanism manufactured, above everything else, was persuasion. It trained men to shape minds. The Medici understood this from the beginning. The curriculum had ancient roots. Cicero was its patron saint. Cicero, who had argued in the Roman Senate, defended clients before hostile judges, written the treatises on rhetoric that defined how a man should speak in public, and whose Latin was so pure and precise that it served as a model for imitation 1,000 years after his death. Petrarch had rediscovered Cicero's personal letters in a cathedral library in Verona in 1345, and the discovery had been electric because it revealed Cicero not as an abstraction, but as a man, a brilliant, anxious, politically engaged man who cared passionately about the Republic and died trying to defend it. The humanists who followed Petrarch read those letters and heard in them an invitation to be something similar. Men of learning who were also men of action, who bent the world with words. That model was exactly what the Medici needed. Poggio Bracciolini spent the years between 1414 and 1417 at the Council of Constance as a papal secretary, and in his spare time he ransacked the monastic libraries of southern Germany and Switzerland for manuscripts. He found a complete copy of Quintilian's Institutes of Oratory, the most comprehensive manual of rhetoric from classical antiquity, lost to Western Europe for over 1,000 years. He found 10 additional speeches of Cicero. He found Vitruvius on architecture. He found Lucretius on the nature of things. He found them in monastic scriptoria where they had sat, unread and barely preserved, or for centuries, copied by monks who had no idea what they contained. Poggio had them copied and sent to Florence. The manuscripts were distributed through the Medici network. What had been silence became, almost overnight, curriculum. Leonardo Bruni was the Chancellor of Florence, the city's senior administrator and chief rhetorical voice, from 1427 until his death in 1444. He was one of Chrysoloras' original students, a man who had abandoned law to learn Greek and had spent 30 years translating Aristotle, Plato, and Plutarch into the best Latin anyone in Western Europe had produced since antiquity. He wrote the first substantial history of Florence, casting the city as the direct heir of Republican Rome, the last true republic standing against tyranny. It was a political argument dressed as history. Under Bruni, the Florentine chancellery produced documents in classical Latin of a quality that dazzled the courts of Europe, and that quality itself was a political statement. Florence did not only have money, it had the language of civilization. The claim that Florence was Rome's heir was not incidental propaganda. It was the central ideological move of the early Renaissance, and it required sustained intellectual labor to maintain. Roman history had to be read, re-edited, and reinterpreted. The distinction between the good republic and the corrupt empire had to be drawn carefully, so that Florence's merchant oligarchs could be cast as the equivalents of Cicero's senatorial class rather than Caesar's creatures. The ruins of Rome, when Florentine humanists visited them, were not treated as evidence of decay, but as instructions. Here is what we were. Here is what we must become again. The past was weaponized, and the scholars who knew it best were the ones who got to wield it. Cosimo de' Medici founded the first public library in Florence at the convent of San Marco in 1444, stocked with manuscripts his agents had been collecting for decades across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. The library was open to scholars free of charge. This was not an act of private luxury, but of public positioning. Cosimo, as the man who gave the city its memory, who restored to Florence the textual patrimony that the dark centuries had taken from it. Every scholar who sat in that library, every humanist who used its resources to produce his translations and histories and philosophical treatises, owed his access to the man who had built it. The library was a network of obligation dressed as generosity, and it worked perfectly. Cosimo hired the young Marsilio Ficino's father as his personal physician, took an interest in the son's education, and eventually, in 1462, gave Ficino a villa outside Florence and a collection of Greek manuscripts with a single instruction: translate Plato into Latin. What Ficino produced over the following decade was not merely a translation, it was a reinterpretation. He took Plato's philosophy and folded it into a framework he called Neoplatonism, a synthesis of Platonic idealism, Neoplatonic mysticism, Hermetic theology, and Christian doctrine that proposed a universe structured by love, ascending from material beauty toward divine perfection. The human soul, in Ficino's system, it occupied the center of this great chain of being. Beauty was a path to God. The artist who perceived and rendered beauty was engaged in a spiritual act. The patron who funded that artist was funding the ascent of the soul. That philosophical proposition was not neutral. A banking family could not easily claim divine sanction for its power. The church had rules about money, and everyone knew how the Medici had made theirs. But a family that positioned itself as the patron of beauty, the guardian of classical learning, the sponsor of a philosophical tradition that proposed beauty itself as the path to God, that family had found a way around the problem. The Neoplatonic framework transformed the Medici's cultural expenditure from ostentation into theology. They were not spending money on beautiful things because they were rich. They were spending money on beautiful things because beauty mattered, because the ascent of the soul required it, because Florence's cultural leadership was not a commercial accident, but a spiritual destiny. Every florin spent on art was a florin spent on God. The argument was elegant, and it was almost entirely constructed. Ficino ran the Platonic Academy from a villa at Careggi, near Cosimo's own estate, from the early 1460s until the mid-1490s. It was never a formal institution with enrolled students and official lectures. It was a circle, an informal gathering of philosophers, poets, scholars, and the Medici family themselves, meeting to discuss Platonic texts, debate theological questions, and write letters to each other full of the elevated language of Neoplatonic love and friendship. Lorenzo de' Medici was a member and a genuine participant, a published poet who wrote in Tuscan with real skill and who clearly cared about the philosophical conversations happening in his family's orbit. Angelo Poliziano, the finest Latin poet of the century, was Lorenzo's personal secretary and his children's tutor. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, perhaps the most spectacularly learned man in Europe, was a regular guest. This was the intellectual court of Florence, and it ran through the Medici palace on the Via Larga like a current. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola arrived in Lorenzo's circle in the mid-1480s, 23 years old and already impossibly erudite. He spoke Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. He had studied Aristotelian philosophy at Padua, Platonic philosophy with Ficino, Kabbalistic mysticism from Jewish teachers, and the Hermetic texts attributed to the ancient sage Hermes Trismegistus. In 1486, he published 900 theses on religion, philosophy, natural philosophy, and magic, and proposed to defend all of them publicly in Rome against any scholar in Europe who cared to challenge him. His introduction to those theses, written in 1486, published after his death, eventually titled The Oration on the Dignity of Man, proposed that the human being occupied no fixed place in the chain of existence, but could become anything, ascending toward the divine or descending toward the bestial by the exercise of free will. It was called, centuries later, the Manifesto of the Renaissance. At the time, it was also a piece of ideology. Man is not fixed, man is free. And the men who cultivate that freedom through learning and beauty are the highest expression of humanity's potential. Pope Innocent VIII banned the debate and condemned 13 of Pico's theses as heretical. Pico fled Italy for France, was arrested, and ended up back in Florence under Lorenzo's personal protection. Lorenzo sheltered him from the papacy, negotiated his rehabilitation, and gave him a villa near Fiesole to work in. In doing so, Lorenzo demonstrated something the Medici had been demonstrating for 3 generations. Their cultural patronage was not merely aesthetic. It was protection. The scholars gathered under the Medici umbrella worked in an environment where intellectual risk was absorbed by political and financial power. You could propose that magic and Kabbalah proved Christ's divinity. And if Lorenzo was your patron, the Pope could not simply destroy you. The Medici had not just funded a philosophical circle, they had made Florence the place where the most ambitious thinking in Europe could survive. The Studia Humanitatis spread outward from Florence with the speed of a curriculum. The men who had trained in the new learning became chancellors, secretaries, ambassadors, and bishops across the Italian peninsula and eventually across Europe. They wrote the documents of state in classical Latin. They composed the speeches that marked public occasions. They drafted the diplomatic correspondence between courts. They taught the sons of other wealthy families who became educated in the same tradition and carried its assumptions into their own adult lives. Within 2 generations, the humanist curriculum had become the standard education for any man who aspired to public life in the Latin West. The Medici had not started that process. Petrarch and Boccaccio and Chrysoloras had laid the ground, but they had funded it, housed it, protected it, and directed it. They had turned an intellectual tendency into a continental institution. Latin text recovery continued through the middle decades of the century, with a systematic intensity that looked less like scholarship and more like archaeology. Agents traveled through monastic libraries across Europe and the Ottoman territories, hunting for manuscripts, assessing their condition, negotiating their purchase or copying. Niccolò Niccoli, who had trained under Chrysoloras and spent his life building a personal manuscript library, left his collection to Cosimo on his death in 1437, which Cosimo used to stock the San Marco library. Lorenzo's agents reached into the Ottoman world for Greek texts, into Spain for Arabic translations of ancient philosophy, into England and France and Germany for surviving Latin manuscripts. By the time Lorenzo died in 1492, the Medici library was the largest and most comprehensive in Western Europe. It contained, in its manuscripts and books, most of what we know of classical antiquity. The physical act of producing manuscripts and books was itself a form of infrastructure. Copying a manuscript required a trained scribe working for weeks or months. Correcting a translation required a scholar who knew both the source language and the target. Printing, which arrived in Italy in the 1460s, required compositors, type founders, paper merchants, and booksellers. The Medici funded all of these operations at various points, directly and indirectly, as patrons of scholars who produced texts that required copying, and as clients of the Florentine book trade that distributed those texts. The physical circulation of humanist learning across the continent required money at every stage, and much of that money flowed through Florence, and a disproportionate share of it came from the Medici. The books on the shelves of humanist scholars across Europe were, in a very real sense, also a form of Medici patronage. Botticelli painted the Primavera and the Birth of Venus in the early 1480s for a branch of the Medici family. Both paintings are large, complex, and saturated with Neoplatonic content that Ficino, Poliziano, and the inner circle of the Platonic Academy had spent years developing. The Primavera shows Venus presiding over a garden rich with Medici symbols, the orange grove, the laurel, the golden balls, while Mercury at the left edge lifts his staff toward a realm beyond the frame, gesturing toward divine transcendence. The Birth of Venus shows the goddess arriving in the world from the sea, a scene that Neoplatonic philosophy connected to the birth of divine beauty into material existence, and that contemporary viewers would also have read as a reference to Lorenzo, the laurel trees at the right edge, the laurel wreath worn by one of the figures, were explicit puns on his name. The paintings were not simply beautiful. They were arguments. Neoplatonic arguments encoded in pigment, hung on the walls of a Medici villa, visible to the visitors whose patronage and political loyalty the family needed. Art commissions worked as propaganda through a mechanism that was more sophisticated than mere portraiture. A painting that depicted Lorenzo de' Medici as one of the three Magi bringing gifts to the infant Christ, as Botticelli's adoration of the Magi did, and as the Medici commissioned repeatedly in various forms, did not say, "This man is king." It said something more durable. This man is the kind of person who was present at the moment of divine revelation. It placed the Medici not in the political present, but in the sacred past, not in the contingent world of Florentine factional politics, but in the eternal narrative of Christian history. The viewer was not supposed to think the Medici paid for this painting. The viewer was supposed to feel, wordlessly and intuitively, that the Medici belonged to the world the painting described. That feeling, manufactured at scale, was worth more than any number of political speeches. Lorenzo de' Medici had grown up inside this apparatus. He had been tutored by Ficino in Neoplatonic philosophy. He had learned Greek from John Argyropoulos, a Byzantine scholar who had come west after the fall of Constantinople. He wrote poetry in Tuscan that was genuinely good, not the mediocre verses of a powerful man indulged by his entourage, but work of real literary quality, lyrical and melancholy, filled with the classical and Neoplatonic themes that Ficino had taught him. He treated the artists and philosophers around him, unusually for Florence, as intellectual equals. Botticelli and Michelangelo dined at his table. Poliziano was his closest friend. Pico was his guest and protégé. When contemporaries called him the Magnificent, they were not describing his wealth, which was considerable but had been larger in his grandfather's day. They were describing a quality of presence that the entire apparatus of learning and beauty had, over 3 generations, been constructed to produce. The propaganda infrastructure was not a conspiracy in the narrow sense. There was no room in the Medici palace where men gathered to decide which paintings would say which things about power. The painters knew their patrons, the scholars knew their benefactors, and the relationship between what was commissioned and what was needed was understood by everyone involved without requiring explicit statement. Many of the humanist educators genuinely believed in the value of classical learning. The Neoplatonic philosophers genuinely believed in the soul's ascent toward beauty. Botticelli genuinely cared about the problems of representation he was solving. And the Medici genuinely valued these things. Cosimo's love of manuscripts, Lorenzo's love of poetry, were real. What made the system so effective was precisely that it was not cynical. Beauty and power had been fused together so completely that neither the patrons nor the artists could easily say where one ended and the other began. That fusion was the achievement. That fusion was the Renaissance. You are standing in the courtyard of the Medici Palace on the Via Larga in Florence in 1489. It is evening. The courtyard is lit by torches, and the men gathered here include Ficino, Poliziano, De Pico della Mirandola, and Lorenzo himself, who is 39 years old and in the last years of his life. They are arguing about Plato, specifically about a passage in the Symposium on the nature of divine love, and the argument is fierce and serious and full of laughter. On the walls of the rooms you cannot see from here hang paintings commissioned from the greatest artists of the age, dense with imagery that encodes the philosophical positions being debated tonight. Downstairs, in a locked room, the accounts ledgers of the Medici Bank record the transactions that pay for all of it, the scholars' stipends, the artists' commissions, the libraries, the agents hunting manuscripts in distant cities. The argument about Plato and the ledger in the locked room are two expressions of the same thing. Here, and you are standing at the exact center of where the modern world was made. The audience for this apparatus was not only the Florentine public. It was the courts of Italy and Europe, the papal curia, the competing oligarchs of Venice and Milan and Naples, the kings of France and England who sent ambassadors to Florence and received back gifts, paintings, manuscripts, philosophical treatises, diplomatic letters composed in the finest Latin of the age. Every court that received a gift from Lorenzo and looked at its quality understood without being told that Florence was not merely a city of bankers. It was the center of learning, of beauty, of civilization itself. The Medici had built over 90 years, not just a financial empire and a political machine. Is he but a cultural proposition, a claim about what power looked like when it was also enlightened? That claim would prove powerful beyond anything they had planned. It would outlast the bank, outlast the republic, and outlast the family itself. What made the proposition work was that it was not only a claim. The art was real. The philosophy was real. The translations that made Plato available to every educated person in Europe were real. The scholars who had come from Byzantium with their manuscripts, the young men who had spent years learning Greek from dying scholars, the poets who had actually written beautiful poems, none of it was false. The beauty was genuine, the learning was genuine, the intellectual ambition was genuine. What the Medici had understood, earlier and more clearly than anyone else, was that genuine things can also be instruments. Truth and propaganda are not opposites. The most powerful propaganda is the kind that is also true. The Medici had built both at the same time, in the same rooms, with the same money, and the result was something the world had never quite seen before. A civilization manufactured out of authentic materials. The framework was now complete. It had taken 3 generations. Giovanni de Bicci had built the money. Cosimo had built the institutions, the bank, the library, the scholarly network, the political machine that ran Florence without appearing to rule it. Lorenzo had built the culture, the Platonic Academy, the sculptor's garden, the poet's circle, the diplomatic network through which Florentine cultural prestige radiated across the continent. The propaganda infrastructure was in place, philosophical, artistic, educational, diplomatic. It told a story about power so beautiful and so apparently true that the story itself became a kind of reality. What remained was the question of the individual works it produced, the paintings, the sculptures, the buildings, the texts, and the men who made them, who were neither free nor unfree, neither purely instruments nor purely geniuses, but something more complicated and more human than either of those words can hold. A boy who wanted to become a painter in 15th century Florence entered a workshop at around the age of 12 or 14. He swept the floors. He ground pigments. He stretched canvas and prepared panels. He drew from plaster casts of ancient sculpture, from the workshop's collection of drawings, and eventually from the human figure. He mixed paints and prepared grounds and ran errands for his master. After several years, if he was good enough, he began to assist on actual commissions, painting backgrounds, executing secondary figures, filling in areas the master had sketched but not finished. He was learning a trade, not exploring a vocation, and the men who ran the workshops were craftsmen first, even when they were also geniuses. The workshop system was the engine of Renaissance art, and it ran on apprentice labor, guild regulation, contractual obligation, and the taste of whoever was paying. Filippo Brunelleschi had trained as a goldsmith before he became the most important architect of the century. Yet he lost a competition in 1401 to design the bronze doors of the Florence baptistery. The judges gave the commission to Lorenzo Ghiberti, and the defeat was so wounding that he left Florence for Rome with his friend Donatello, the two of them spending years measuring ruins, calculating proportions, reconstructing the geometry of ancient structures by hand. What Brunelleschi brought back from Rome was not merely knowledge, it was a method. The systematic application of mathematical perspective to architectural design, the recovery of classical proportion as a working language, and the conviction that antiquity contained engineering solutions that the medieval world had forgotten. When Florence held a new competition in 1418 to crown its cathedral with the dome that had been waiting without a solution for over a century, Brunelleschi won, but he spent 16 years building it. The dome of Santa Maria del Fiore was the largest structure of its kind built anywhere in the world since the ancient Pantheon. It spanned an octagonal base nearly 42 meters across, and no one at the time Brunelleschi proposed to build it had a clear theory of how it could be done. He refused to share his methods during the competition, afraid competitors would steal them. He invented mobile scaffolding that attached to the rising structure and moved upward with the construction. He developed a herringbone brickwork pattern that distributed the dome's weight in ways that eliminated the need for the wooden centering frames that would normally have been essential. He diluted his workers' wine with water so they would not get vertigo on the heights, and when they went on strike for better pay, he replaced them with cheaper workers from Lombardy. The genius and the hardness were inseparable. When the dome was consecrated in 1436, it was visible from every quarter of Florence and from the hills for miles around. You could see it from the road coming down from Fiesole. You could see it from the fields south of the Arno. It rose above everything else in the city with the absolute confidence of something that could not have been otherwise, and that confidence was part of the statement. Florence had built something Rome had not been able to build for 1,000 years. The dome was propaganda before Cosimo de' Medici commissioned a single painting. It announced that Florence had returned, that classical civilization was alive again in this city, that the men who ran this city were the heirs of the ancient world. Brunelleschi had not set out to make a political statement, he had set out to solve an engineering problem. The statement was the solution. Donatello spent the same years in Rome studying the same ruins, and what he brought back was different from what Brunelleschi brought back, though it came from the same source. Where Brunelleschi recovered proportion and structure, Donatello recovered the human body, the specific weight and mass and psychological presence that ancient sculpture had achieved, and medieval art had largely abandoned. His figures occupied space. They had muscles under their stone or bronze surfaces. They looked like men and women who were about to move, or who had just stopped moving. When he made his marble St. George for the Guild Church of Orson-Michel in the 1410s, he placed the figure in a shallow niche with its weight shifted slightly to one leg, its head turned, its expression alert, the first contrapposto figure in centuries, the first sculpture that stood the way a person actually stands, rather than the way a religious image was supposed to stand. The bronze David that Donatello made for Cosimo de' Medici, probably in the 1440s, was placed on a column in the center of the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici, visible to every visitor who passed through the main gate. It was the first freestanding male nude sculpture cast since antiquity, a boy standing in the moment after killing Goliath, one foot on the severed head, his posture relaxed and slightly swaying, his expression unreadable. The base of the column carried an inscription, now lost, that scholars have reconstructed as something close to, "The victor is whoever defends the fatherland." David was Florence's civic symbol, the small republic that had defeated the Milanese tyrant Gian Galeazzo Visconti in 1402, the city that always faced its enemies without armor and with God. The Medici had taken that civic symbol, placed it in their private courtyard, and made it theirs. It was a political act performed in bronze, and Donatello executed it with a precision and sensuality that made the politics feel like art. Sandro Botticelli was born in 1445 and trained first as a goldsmith, then in the workshop of Fra Filippo Lippi, whose handling of paint, warm, lyrical, charged with emotional transparency, shaped Botticelli's eye more than any other single influence. By his late 20s, he was one of the most sought-after painters in Florence, working for the Medici and their circle on a series of commissions that required not just technical skill, but a precise intellectual understanding of the Neoplatonic and classical programs the patrons wanted encoded in the works. The Primavera was not a painting you commissioned from a craftsman who followed a brief. It required a painter who understood what Ficino meant by the two Venuses, who knew the relevant passages in Ovid's Fasti, who could translate the philosophical argument about love's ascent from physical to divine into a 9-figure composition that worked as an image, as an allegory, and as political statement simultaneously. Botticelli knew all of this. He was not a passive instrument of his patron's intellectual programs, but he was a participant in the circle. He was in the Medici orbit, he knew Poliziano and almost certainly consulted with him on the Primavera's iconography. He attended the same festivals where the philosophical ideas the paintings encoded were debated. But he was also operating inside a system of obligations and dependencies that left very little room for the kind of autonomous artistic freedom the Romantic tradition later attributed to Renaissance genius. The commissions specified the subject, the contracts specified the materials, ultramarine of the value of 4 florins the ounce. Ghirlandaio's contract for the Ospedale degli Innocenti stated explicitly gold where gold was required. The patrons approved preliminary drawings before a single stroke of final paint went down. Botticelli worked within all of this with brilliant, uncontained intelligence. Ghirlandaio was the finest fresco painter of his generation and the man who taught Michelangelo, who entered his workshop as an apprentice in 1488. He worked faster than almost anyone else of comparable quality, and that speed was itself a form of technical virtuosity. His great cycle of frescoes for the Tornabuoni family in the Church of Santa Maria Novella, depicting the life of the Virgin and the life of John the Baptist, filled an entire chapel with scenes that were, on their explicit surface, sacred history, and on another surface entirely, a portrait gallery of Florentine high society, with the Tornabuoni family and their associates appearing among the sacred figures in contemporary dress, standing in biblical scenes as though they had always belonged there. The families who commissioned these frescoes were not confused about what they were paying for. They were buying themselves into the eternal narrative. Ghirlandaio painted them there. Leonardo da Vinci entered Verrocchio's workshop around 1464, when he was 12 or 13, the illegitimate son of a Florentine notary. He trained there for the better part of a decade in painting, sculpture, metalwork, and the technical mechanical arts. He painted one of the angels in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, the leftmost one, the one with the luminous, slightly misted quality that was different from everything else in the painting. And Vasari's account of Verrocchio seeing it and reportedly resolving never to paint again is probably legend, but the legend contains a truth about the quality of the gap. Leonardo left Verrocchio's workshop in 1477 and within 5 years had left Florence entirely, moving to Milan to offer his services to Ludovico Sforza. His letter of introduction to the Duke described at length his abilities as a military engineer, weapons designer, canal builder, and architect, mentioning almost as an afterthought that he could also paint. Leonardo was offering himself as what the period called a court engineer, a man whose value was technical and practical, whose art was one skill among many that the court could deploy as required. He spent 17 years in Milan under Sforza's patronage, designing festivals, planning fortifications, producing the Last Supper for the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, and working on a colossal bronze equestrian monument to Sforza's predecessor that was never cast. The monument's clay model was later destroyed by French soldiers using it for target practice after Sforza's fall in 1499. Leonardo spent most of the rest of his life moving between courts, Bologna, Venice, Florence again, Rome, eventually France, in a pattern that looks from the outside like the restlessness of genius, but was in fact the structural condition of an artist in the patronage system. You worked until the patron fell, and then you found another one. Michelangelo entered Lorenzo de' Medici's household around 1490, when he was 14 or 15. He had been training in Ghirlandaio's workshop and had shown exceptional ability, and Lorenzo had him brought to the Medici palace to study the sculpture garden at San Marco, a collection of ancient statues that Lorenzo had assembled as a teaching resource, being staffed by the sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni, who had trained under Donatello. Michelangelo ate at Lorenzo's table. He attended the philosophical discussions of the Platonic Academy. He heard Ficino and Poliziano and Pico arguing about the soul's ascent through beauty. When he was still 14 or 15, Poliziano suggested a subject for a relief, the Battle of the Centaurs, and Michelangelo executed it. The Neoplatonic ideas that ran through his greatest work, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the slaves, the pietas, were not ideas he encountered later in life as an influence. He absorbed them in adolescence at Lorenzo's dinner table as the intellectual atmosphere of his formation. The status of artists was shifting visibly across the 15th century, and that shift was itself a product of the patronage system's logic. In the medieval period, the painter or sculptor was an anonymous craftsman. He belonged to a guild. His work was valued for its materials. Gold cost more than silver, ultramarine cost more than ochre, and for the piety of its subject, not for the individual skill of whoever had executed it. By the mid-15th century, that was changing. Patrons were beginning to value the specific hand, the specific eye, the specific intelligence of individual artists, and that valuation was transforming how artists understood themselves. Alberti wrote a treatise arguing that painting was a liberal art, a discipline of the intellect, not a manual trade. Artists began to appear in their own works. Ghiberti put his portrait in the baptistry doors. Botticelli placed himself in the adoration of the Magi. They had names, and their names meant something. But that shift in status was not straightforwardly liberating. The more an artist's individual genius was valued, the more precisely that genius was harnessed. A craftsman who made a competent virgin and child had a degree of interchangeability. Another craftsman could have done it. A painter whose specific vision was the point of the commission could not be replaced, which meant he could negotiate on price and terms. But it also meant that the patron's investment was in him specifically, which created obligations and dependencies that were, in some ways, tighter than the guild relationships they replaced. Botticelli's reputation was so closely tied to Medici patronage that when the Medici fell in 1494, his commissions dried up and he spent the last decade of his life in poverty. The artist who had been the visual expression of the golden age of Florentine humanism did not survive the end of that age. The paintings and sculptures contain within them the records of these negotiations, obligations, and survivals, if you know how to look. Ghirlandaio's Tornabuoni frescoes show their patron standing in the Temple of Jerusalem, wearing Florentine dress, participating in the visitation of the Virgin as though they lived in biblical Judea and 15th century Florence simultaneously. The Medici appear in the adoration of the Magi so regularly across so many commissions that their presence there becomes a kind of visual shorthand for the claim the family was constantly making about itself, that it belonged to the sacred story, that its arrival in any scene elevated the scene. With that, Florentine merchant bankers and the Magi who brought gifts to the infant Christ occupied the same moral universe. The paintings are saying this. The paintings were paid to say it. Brunelleschi died in 1446 and was buried in the crypt of the cathedral his dome had crowned. a burial reserved until then for saints and bishops. His epitaph celebrated his invention and his genius in terms that would have been unthinkable for an architect a century earlier. His body was in the floor of the great building his mind had made. That position, the individual intelligence honored inside the institution it had created, captures something essential about the Renaissance artist's condition, neither purely free nor purely instrument, but genuinely creative within a system of constraints that were also, in some fundamental sense, the conditions that made the creativity possible. Without the patronage, the dome might never have been built. Without the problem the dome posed, Brunelleschi's specific genius might never have found its occasion. The constraints and the genius were not opposed. They produced each other. What the artists knew, the thing they all knew in different registers with different degrees of explicit consciousness, was that the beauty they were making was also doing something else. Botticelli knew that the Primavera was not only a painting about love. Donatello knew that the David was not only a sculpture about a biblical story. Ghirlandaio knew that the Tornabuoni frescoes were not only pictures of sacred history. They were also arguments, and the men who had commissioned them were also making those arguments, and the painters and sculptors were the instruments through which the arguments were made visible. Whether this troubled them, whether they felt compromised or constrained or proud of what they were building, the evidence does not say clearly. What the evidence says is that they kept working, kept accepting commissions, kept making things of extraordinary quality within a system that needed and valued that quality for reasons that were not purely aesthetic. The work was real. The system was real. Both were true at once. You are walking through Florence in 1490, and everywhere you look is the result of 40 years of this. The dome rises above the city. The bronze doors of the baptistery catch the morning light on their gilded reliefs of biblical scenes, so precisely modeled in 3 dimensions that they look like windows onto another world. Michelangelo will later call them the gates of paradise. The churches contain altarpieces by Filippo Lippi, Fra Angelico, Botticelli. The Medici Palace courtyard holds Donatello's David on its column. The workshops of Ghirlandaio and Verrocchio and Botticelli are busy with commissions. In one of those workshops, a teenage Michelangelo is drawing. In another city a few years from now, a young Leonardo is painting a woman whose smile will be copied for 5 centuries. The city looks inevitable, the way all achieved things look once they are achieved. But every stone of it was decided, paid for, negotiated, and made by very specific people. For very specific reasons, and the fact that it is also beautiful, genuinely beautiful, is precisely what makes it so hard to see clearly for what it also was. There is a question underneath all of this that none of the artists could have answered, and that we still cannot answer cleanly. When beauty is made in the service of power, does the beauty redeem the purpose, or does the purpose corrupt the beauty? The Primavera is one of the most luminous things human hands have ever made. It was also paid for by a family that needed a painting to do political work. Donatello's David is one of the most psychologically complex sculptures in Western history. It was also placed in a private palace to make a civic symbol into a family emblem. These facts do not cancel each other. They coexist in the works as they coexisted in the workshops, thus as they coexisted in the city that produced them. The Renaissance was not a lie dressed in beauty. It was beauty and power fused so completely that separating them now, 500 years later, is like trying to separate the color from the light. The artists were the visible surface of the Renaissance. They were the part that tourists came to see then and come to see now, the paintings, the sculptures, the buildings, the frescoes. But they were not the origin. They were the product. The origin was the money, the manuscripts, the political vacuum, the plague that redistributed inheritance, the schism that delegitimized the church, the Byzantine scholars arriving with their manuscripts, the Neoplatonic philosophy that transformed banking into theology. The artists were the final instrument in a chain of instruments, and they were geniuses, and that is not a contradiction. It is the story. The story is about to crack. The world the artists inhabited, the Medici presiding over a stable, prosperous Florence, the Platonic Academy meeting at Careggi, the great workshops churning out commissions, was more fragile than it looked from the outside. The families had enemies. The papacy had its own agenda. The French were massing north of the Alps, and within Florence itself, a Dominican friar had been preaching to crowds of thousands in the cathedral, and the crowds were growing. And what the friar was saying was that all of this beauty, all of it, was an abomination before God. The spring morning of the 26th of April, 1478 began like any other Sunday in Florence. The cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore was filling with worshippers for the high mass of Easter. Lorenzo de' Medici was 29. His brother Giuliano was 24. They walked through the doors of the building their family had helped build, the building whose dome their grandfather's money had crowned, and took their places among the congregation without any visible cause for alarm. The men waiting to kill them had been planning the attack for nearly a year. The conspiracy had papal backing. Pope Sixtus IV had developed an intense personal hatred of Lorenzo de' Medici, a hatred rooted in money. Lorenzo had refused to finance the Pope's purchase of the town of Imola for his nephew Girolamo Riario, intending to block the consolidation of papal territory uncomfortably close to Florentine interests. Sixtus had responded by transferring the papal banking account from the Medici to their rivals, the Pazzi, and had appointed an archbishop to the see of Pisa without Lorenzo's consent, a deliberate humiliation. The Pazzi family, ancient Florentine nobility, wealthier than the Medici in blood if not always in money, had watched the upstart bankers consolidate power for 2 generations. They made an alliance with the Pope. They recruited a mercenary captain, Girolamo Riario's allies, and the Archbishop of Pisa himself as a co-conspirator. Then, they organized a murder in the most sacred building in Florence during the holiest moment of the Christian year. The original plan had called for the killing to take place at a private banquet. It was moved to the cathedral when circumstances changed. The mercenary captain assigned to kill Lorenzo, a professional soldier named Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, refused to commit murder in a sacred space. He was replaced by 2 priests, apparently with fewer scruples. When the moment came during the Mass at the elevation of the host, Francesco de' Pazzi, and an accomplice fell on Giuliano, they stabbed him 19 times. His blood soaked into the marble floor. Lorenzo was 100 feet away near the altar. The 2 priests assigned to him managed only to graze his neck. He drew a sword, fought them off, and was pulled through the bronze sacristy doors by friends who slammed them shut behind him. The coup failed at every point. The conspirators who tried to seize the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government, were caught inside by the Gonfalonier and his guards. The Archbishop of Pisa was hanged from a window of the Palazzo Vecchio in his vestments, still wearing them. Francesco de' Pazzi was dragged from his bed where he lay with a self-inflicted wound from the assassination. He had stabbed himself in the thigh in the frenzy of attacking Giuliano and hanged from the same windows. The Florentine citizenry did not rise to support the liberators. They hunted the conspirators through the streets. Within a day, over 80 people connected to the plot were executed. One conspirator who fled to Constantinople was extradited by Sultan Mehmed II himself, returned to Florence in Turkish clothing, and hanged. Leonardo da Vinci drew the body as it swung from the window, a calm, precise study of a hanged man, the kind of drawing he made of everything. Lorenzo's response was measured, total, and permanent. The Pazzi family was annihilated as a civic presence. Their name was erased from public records. Streets named after them were renamed. Their coat of arms was obliterated from every building in the city. Anyone named Pazzi was required to take a different name. Their property was confiscated. Their living members were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. It was not violence out of grief or rage, though both were present. It was the careful, systematic elimination of a rival, conducted by a man who understood that the crisis had exposed a weakness and that weakness had to be sealed. The golden age of Florentine humanism continued, more consolidated than before. But everyone who lived through April 1478 understood something that the Primavera and the Platonic Academy had been designed to obscure. The power behind the beauty was entirely capable of killing. The conspiracy also revealed how fragile the papal relationship had become. Pope Sixtus IV, the same pope who had backed the assassination, excommunicated Lorenzo after the attempt's failure, placed Florence under interdict, and brought in the armies of Naples and the Duke of Urbino to attack Florentine territory. Lorenzo's response was one of the most audacious political maneuvers of the century. He sailed alone to Naples and placed himself in the hands of King Ferdinand, the very monarch whose troops were attacking his city, and negotiated a separate peace. The gamble worked. Ferdinand, impressed by Lorenzo's nerve and aware of the broader political risks of a long Italian war, made peace. Sixtus was left without his military partner and had to accept the situation. Lorenzo returned to Florence a hero. The crisis had cost him his brother, a year of war, and a Florentine population that had glimpsed just how exposed the city was. It had not broken him. Girolamo Savonarola arrived in Florence in 1490, summoned, with a terrible irony, at Lorenzo's own request. The Dominican friar from Ferrara had been preaching across northern Italy for years, his sermons drawing enormous crowds with their visions of apocalyptic reckoning, their denunciations of clerical corruption, their promises that God was about to descend in fury on the comfortable and the powerful. Lorenzo, who prided himself on his capacity to manage the intellectuals and prophets his city attracted, installed Savonarola as prior of the convent of San Marco, the very convent Cosimo de' Medici had built and endowed, the one whose library had been stocked with Cosimo's manuscripts. Lorenzo appears to have believed that the friar could be contained, as he had contained others. He was wrong. Savonarola preached in the cathedral to crowds of 10, and then 12, and then 14,000 people, more than could fit inside the building, so that those who could not see the preacher stood in the piazza outside and listened to his voice carry through the open doors. He preached against the Medici, against papal corruption, against the entire culture of wealth and beauty that the Renaissance had constructed. He called the humanist philosophy ungodly. He named Plato and Ficino and Pico among the corruptions of a civilization that had turned away from Christ. He predicted that God would send a foreign king to scourge Italy, and that Florence would be destroyed for its sins unless it repented. His followers were called the Piagnoni, the weepers, and they wept in the streets and gave away their possessions and brought their mirrors and jewelry and books and musical instruments to the bonfires Savonarola organized in the Piazza della Signoria. In early 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici was dying. He was 42 years old and had been in pain for years from a hereditary condition, almost certainly gout, possibly with other complications, that had been worsening since his mid-30s. In March, he was carried to his villa at Careggi, the same villa where the Platonic Academy met, where Ficino had spent 30 years translating Plato, where the most elevated philosophical conversations of the century had taken place. He died there on the 8th of April. Poliziano, who was with him, wrote that the room was filled with men of learning who had devoted their lives to the project Lorenzo had made possible. Ficino was there. Pico was probably there. The world they had built together was not quite over, but it was about to be. Lorenzo's son Piero was 20 years old and politically incompetent in ways that would have been merely awkward in a private citizen and proved catastrophic in the ruler of Florence. In September 1494, the French king Charles VIII crossed the Alps with an army of 20,000 men, the most powerful military force Italy had seen in a generation, moving south through Tuscany toward Naples. Piero de' Medici went out to negotiate. He came back having surrendered more than the French had asked for: Pisa, Livorno, several fortresses, control of Florentine ports. He had given away, in an afternoon, positions that Florence had held and valued for decades, without consulting the councils, without public authorization, without the political intelligence to understand what he was trading away and why. When the news reached Florence, the city turned on him. He was expelled from Florence before the end of November. The Medici palace was looted, and 60 years of family power collapsed in a matter of weeks. Charles VIII's army entered Florence at the end of November 1494. 20,000 soldiers moving through the same streets where Botticelli's workshop still stood and the scaffolding of unfinished commissions still waited. They stayed 11 days. They extracted 150,000 florins from the city, demanded access to Tuscan fortresses, and confirmed that Pisa now belonged to France. Then they marched south. The city that had been the center of European learning, the city whose cultural prestige had been visible from London to Constantinople, had paid a foreign king to leave. The Medici Bank, already weakened by years of bad loans and the loss of papal accounts, effectively collapsed within months. The branches were stripped and shuttered. The institution Giovanni de Bicci had founded in 1397 with 10,000 florins was gone by 1494, 97 years after its founding. Having served as the financial backbone of the greatest cultural project the Western world had ever seen. Into the space left by the Medici stepped Savonarola. He had no formal office. Like Cosimo and Lorenzo before him, he ruled without a title, through influence, through the loyalty of his followers, through the terror his apocalyptic certainty generated in those who heard him. He helped design the new Republican Constitution that replaced the Medici arrangements, establishing a great council of 3,000 Florentine citizens, the broadest democratic assembly the city had ever had. He preached that Florence would become the new Jerusalem, the city at the center of the world's moral renewal, richer and more powerful than ever, if it obeyed God. His followers organized children into squads that patrolled the streets, enforcing moral codes, reporting violations, collecting luxury items for the bonfires. The bonfire of the Vanities took place on the 7th of February, 1497, during the Mardi Gras season. Savonarola's followers built a pyramid 60 feet high in the Piazza della Signoria and set it alight. Into the fire went mirrors, cosmetics, jewelry, fine clothing, musical instruments, playing cards, gaming tables, and works of art. Books by Boccaccio and Petrarch, the same Petrarch whose recovery of Cicero had started the whole humanist project, were burned. Botticelli, who had fallen under Savonarola's spell, threw some of his own paintings into the fire. Donatello's sculpture of a baby Jesus was carried through the streets by Savonarola's youths as the bonfires burned. The paintings commissioned by the Medici, encoded with Neoplatonic philosophy, saturated with references to classical mythology and Florentine power. Many of them ended in those flames. The propaganda infrastructure of the Renaissance was literally burning in the square. Savonarola had identified something real. The discontent that fueled his sermons was not simply hysteria or ignorance. Florence's extraordinary wealth had always rested on the labor of thousands of textile workers, many of them desperately poor, who had never benefited from the Platonic Academy or the Sculpture Garden or the commissions to Botticelli. The humanist program had served the oligarchy, brilliantly, magnificently, in ways that had genuinely elevated human civilization, but it had served the oligarchy. Savonarola's crowds understood this at the level of feeling, even when they could not have articulated it as analysis. The beauty had been real. The inequality that funded it had also been real. Both were true, and the city held them both, and after 60 years of one truth being celebrated and the other suppressed, the suppressed one erupted. But Savonarola's republic was also not what it claimed to be. He had no formal power and held no office, but he governed through moral terror as effectively as any tyrant through political force. He burned books, he burned art, he burned the very objects that had made Florence the envy of Europe on the grounds that they were sins against God. His followers denounced neighbors. Women who dressed immodestly were harassed in the streets by gangs of children. The Florentine carnival, the same carnival for which Lorenzo had written bawdy songs, was replaced by religious processions and public weeping. The city that had been the laboratory of the modern world was being dismantled from the inside by a man who believed the modern world was an abomination. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, the most politically ruthless pope of the century, excommunicated Savonarola in May 1497 and threatened Florence with interdict if it continued to harbor him. For a while the city held firm. Then, in April 1498, a rival preacher challenged Savonarola to a trial by fire, walk through flames and emerge unscathed, prove that God was with you. It was a trap and an absurdity, but Savonarola could not refuse without losing his divine mandate. The trial was organized. An enormous crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria. Then it rained, and the Florentine government canceled the event. The crowd went home furious, not with the government but with Savonarola, who had failed to appear, who had sent one of his followers in his place, who had not walked through fire when God had presumably arranged the weather. Popular opinion, which had carried him, turned in an afternoon. Within weeks, Savonarola was arrested. He was tortured until he confessed that his prophecies had been invented. He recanted the confession. He was tortured again and confessed again. On the morning of the 23rd of May, 1498, he and two of his closest disciples were brought out into the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where the bonfire of the Vanities had burned, the same square from whose windows the Pazzi conspirators had been hanged, and publicly humiliated by being stripped of their Dominican robes, then hanged on 3 separate gallows while fires were lit beneath their bodies. The executioners added gunpowder to the wood. The bodies burned slowly. One witness recorded that Savonarola's right hand moved in the flames so that it appeared he was blessing the crowd. His ashes were carted off and thrown into the Arno from the Ponte Vecchio. Nothing was left that could be venerated as a relic. The period from 1492 to 1498 had stripped the Florentine Renaissance down to its structural components. Lorenzo was dead. The Medici were in exile. The bank was gone. Botticelli had burned his paintings. The Platonic Academy had dispersed. Pico had died in 1494, almost certainly poisoned, at the age of 31. Poliziano had died the same year, also probably poisoned. The art workshop survived. Ghirlandaio continued working. Leonardo was already in Milan. Michelangelo was moving between cities. But the network of obligation and patronage and philosophical purpose that had given those workshops their ideological coherence had dissolved. Florence was still Florence. It still had its dome and its streets and its traditions and its Arno. But the specific, engineered, self-conscious project that had been the Renaissance, that was over. What the fractures revealed was what was always true but had been obscured by the project's success. The Renaissance had been sustained by a set of conditions so fragile and so particular that a single generation's political failure could dismantle it entirely. It required a specific family with specific wealth and specific intellectual ambitions at the center of a specific city, at a specific historical moment when classical learning was flowing west from the collapsing Byzantine world, and the papacy's moral authority was weak enough to leave room for a different kind of legitimacy. Remove any of those conditions, and the whole structure weakens. The Medici fell, and the workshop scattered, and the friar burned the paintings, and the bank closed, and the world the project had made, the world of Ficino's translations and Botticelli's allegories and Pico's oration and Lorenzo's poetry, went from being a living culture to being a legacy. A legacy that, it turned out, was indestructible. The manuscripts had been copied, the translations had been printed and distributed, the ideas had moved north into the courts of France and England and Germany, into the curriculum of universities, into the minds of a generation of scholars who had read Ficino and Pico and been changed by what they read. The bonfire of the Vanities had burned objects. It could not burn the ideas the objects had carried. Savonarola's ashes went into the Arno, and the Medici went into exile, and Charles VIII's soldiers went home with their 150,000 florins, and none of it could undo what had already been done. The Renaissance had escaped Florence before Florence fell. It was already, by 1498, the possession of the world. By the time Savonarola's ashes went into the Arno in May of 1498, the Renaissance had already traveled beyond the reach of anyone who wanted to stop it. The printing press had seen to that. Gutenberg's invention arrived in Europe in the 1450s, precisely as Ficino was beginning his translations of Plato, precisely as the Byzantine scholars were arriving with their manuscripts, precisely as the whole enterprise of classical recovery was hitting its full productive stride. A single press could produce up to 3,600 pages in a working day. By 1500, the presses of Western Europe had produced more than 20 million volumes. The manuscripts that had taken decades to copy and distribute by hand could now be multiplied in weeks and sent to every city that had a bookseller. The ideas had been printed before the bonfires were lit. The fire could not catch them. Ficino's Latin translation of the complete works of Plato, finished around 1468 and printed in 1484, are circulated throughout Europe within years of its publication. Scholars who had never been to Florence, who had never met Ficino or Poliziano or Pico, who had never sat in the garden at Careggi or heard Lorenzo read his poetry aloud, read those dialogues and were changed by them. The Neoplatonic framework, the universe organized by love and beauty, the human soul at the center of the chain of being, the capacity of the individual to ascend toward the divine through reason and contemplation, moved north into France, into Germany, into the Low Countries, into England, carried in books and in the minds of scholars who had trained in Italy and gone home again with what they had learned. Erasmus of Rotterdam was 26 when Savonarola burned his books. He had already read Valla and Ficino. And he would spend the next 4 decades as the most influential scholar in Northern Europe, a man who corresponded with kings, advised emperors, translated the New Testament from the original Greek, and wrote in praise of folly in a week while staying at Thomas More's house in London, as a joke that turned out to contain most of the serious arguments about power and corruption that the century needed to make. Erasmus had no patron in the Medici sense. The printing press was his patron. It made him a European figure without requiring him to attach himself permanently to any court or family. The infrastructure of Renaissance learning had escaped the patronage system that had created it. The humanism that moved north was not identical to the humanism of Florence. It mixed with northern Christianity in ways that produced something different, more reform-minded, more focused on the text of Scripture as opposed to classical mythology, less comfortable with the synthesis of paganism and Christianity that Ficino had managed in the Platonic Academy. Erasmus's Christian humanism wanted to recover the purity of early Christianity through the same methods the Florentines had used to recover classical antiquity, going back to the original sources, correcting the corrupted Latin of the medieval tradition against the original Greek. The method was Florentine. The subject was the Bible. The consequence was the Reformation. Martin Luther read Erasmus. He used the tools of Renaissance scholarship, textual criticism, philology, under the insistence on returning to primary sources to argue that the Church had corrupted the faith it claimed to protect. The Renaissance had not meant to produce the Reformation, but it had handed the Reformation its instruments. The model of the court as a center of cultural patronage spread across Europe with the same velocity as the books. The French kings Francis I and then Henry II built collections, hired Italian artists, and positioned themselves as patrons in the Florentine manner, not because they admired Florence for its own sake, but because the Florentine model had defined what a ruler with claims to civilizational authority was supposed to do. Francis I brought Leonardo da Vinci to France in 1516 and gave him a pension and a manor house near the royal chateau at Amboise. Leonardo spent 3 years there, while drawing and thinking, before dying in 1519. The king, by some accounts, held the old man's head in his hands as he died. Whether or not this is literally true, the image it creates is historically true. The Renaissance master cradled in the arms of the northern monarch who had purchased him. The Medici model had become the European model. The English courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII imported Italian scholars, bought Italian manuscripts, commissioned portraits from painters trained in the Flemish and Italian traditions. The Tudor dynasty's investment in humanist learning was not a luxury. It was a political necessity. A king who wanted to be taken seriously by the new Europe of print and courts and learned ambassadors had to demonstrate mastery of the cultural language that Florence had invented. Thomas More's Utopia, written in 1516 in the elegant Latin of the humanist tradition, was in some sense a Florentine document. It used classical learning, dialogue form, and Neoplatonic ideas about the ideal society as the framework for one of the most serious critiques of power and inequality the English language had ever produced. More had been trained in the Studia Humanitatis. He turned the tools of Medici propaganda back against the princes who used it. The Studia Humanitatis, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, became the standard curriculum of European education for the next 3 centuries. The grammar schools of England, the Jesuit colleges of the Catholic world, the humanist gymnasiums of Protestant Germany, all taught the same 5 disciplines in the same sequence, but using the same classical Latin authors the Florentines had recovered. Every educated person in Western Europe from roughly 1500 to 1800 had read Cicero, Virgil, Livy, and Plutarch. The particular texts that Petrarch and Bruni and Poggio had hunted out of monastic libraries, the texts that Chrysoloras had taught Florentine students to read in the original Greek, the texts that Cosimo had his agents hunt across the Mediterranean, those texts were the intellectual common ground of the Western world. Florentine banking had paid for the recovery of the Western mind. The Renaissance also exported a model of power that proved more durable than the specific political arrangements it had served. The Medici had demonstrated that cultural authority could substitute for, or at minimum reinforce, political legitimacy in ways that purely military or financial power could not. A ruler who funded art and learning was not just displaying wealth, he was claiming a different kind of standing, the standing of a civilization's guardian, of a people's patron, of the man whose vision and generosity had made beautiful things exist that would not otherwise have existed. That claim did not require Florence. It did not require the Medici. It could be made by any ruler who had enough money and enough political intelligence to understand what it meant. Courts across Europe made it for the next 200 years. The idea of the individual, not the individual soul in its relationship to God, which the Church had always recognized, but the individual mind in its relationship to the world, its capacity for achievement, its claim to recognition on the basis of what it had made or thought or said, that idea was perhaps the Renaissance's deepest and most consequential gift to the future. Pico had argued in the Oration on the Dignity of Man that the human being occupied no fixed position in the hierarchy of existence and could become anything through the exercise of free will. Ficino had argued that the human soul was the hinge of the universe, positioned between the material and the divine, capable of rising toward God or descending toward matter by the choices it made. These were not just philosophical propositions. They were the first systematic arguments for human potential as an open-ended project, arguments that eventually, over centuries of transmission and transformation, became the intellectual bedrock of rights, of democracy, of the modern conviction that individual lives matter and individual achievements deserve recognition. None of that was what the Medici had intended to produce. They had intended to produce legitimacy for a banking dynasty in a particular city-state in 15th century Italy. They had funded Ficino's translations because Neoplatonic philosophy made their power look like destiny. They had commissioned Botticelli because beautiful paintings with Medici symbols embedded in them told the right story about who the Medici were. The gap between what they intended and what they caused is one of the great ironies of history, and it is also one of its most important lessons, that ideas, once made genuine, cannot be controlled by the people who commissioned them. The beauty was real. The philosophy was real. The translations were real. And real things have consequences their makers cannot foresee. The Renaissance had been a project, and the project had served specific interests, and those interests were often brutal. The assassination of a 24-year-old in a cathedral, the systematic destruction of a rival family's name, the burning of books in a public square, the torture and execution of a man whose prophecies had been believed too completely. The beauty did not erase any of that, but the beauty survived. The Primavera is still in the Uffizi. The dome still rises over Florence. Ficino's translations of Plato are still read. The Studia Humanitatis became the liberal arts. And the liberal arts became the curriculum of universities, and the universities produced the scientists and philosophers and writers who made the modern world. The pipeline from Cosimo de' Medici's decision to fund a young translator in a villa outside Florence in 1462 to the Declaration of Independence, or the scientific method, or the modern university, is not direct, and it is not clean, and it passes through centuries of war and transformation. But it exists. The fact that the Renaissance was constructed, that it was made by identifiable people with identifiable interests operating in a specific historical window, does not diminish it. The argument of this whole story has been that it makes the achievement more remarkable, not less. Anyone can produce greatness by accident, producing it deliberately, under pressure, maybe from a position of political fragility, using the wreckage of plague and institutional collapse as your raw material. That is a different order of accomplishment. The Medici did not know they were making the modern world. They were trying to hold power in Florence. The Byzantine scholars did not know they were handing the West a new intellectual tradition. They were fleeing the Ottoman army with whatever they could carry. The artists did not know their workshops were the laboratories of a civilization. They were filling contracts and meeting clients and trying to survive in a competitive market. Out of all of that, all the calculation and terror and beauty and money, something genuine and permanent was made. That is the story. Not despite those conditions, but because of them. You are standing in the Uffizi in Florence in the present day. Around you, in a long, narrow room, hang the great works of the Florentine 15th century, the Primavera, the Birth of Venus, portraits of the Medici and sacred scenes. On one side of the room, the paintings that were propaganda. On the other side, the paintings that were masterpieces. They are the same paintings. The tourists moving through the room are the descendants, in every meaningful sense, of the project that paid for these works, not because their ancestors were Florentine, but because the education they received, the way they think about themselves as individuals with dignity and potential, the assumption embedded in their lives that beauty matters and that the pursuit of knowledge is worthwhile, all of that traces back, through a long chain of transmission and transformation, to this room. They are looking at the inheritance. Most of them have no idea how it was made. Now you do. The Renaissance was the first time in the modern world that a group of people, a specific identifiable group with names and addresses and bank accounts, understood that culture could be built deliberately, that beauty could be engineered, that the story a civilization tells about itself could be shaped by whoever was willing to pay for the telling. Every institution that has ever funded art, every government that has ever built a library, every patron who has ever commissioned a painting or endowed a university chair, every corporation that has ever put its name on a concert hall. All of them are working from the Medici template, whether they know it or not. The template is, power needs beauty, beauty needs money, and the combination, when it is done well enough and long enough, stops being a transaction and becomes a civilization. That is the lesson Florence teaches. That is what the Renaissance left behind. The contradiction that opened this story, beauty built by ruthless men, genius funded by calculation, the most transcendent cultural achievement in Western history produced by bankers who needed it for political reasons, is not really a contradiction. It never was. It was always the same thing. The beauty and the power were fused so completely at the moment of creation that no amount of subsequent analysis can separate them without destroying what makes both sides interesting. The Medici needed the art needed the Medici. The beauty was real, and the motives were impure, and both of those things are true at the same time. And the world we live in is a consequence of that specific, paradoxical, magnificent fusion. To understand it clearly, without the myth of spontaneous genius on one side or the myth of cynical manipulation on the other, is to understand something important about how civilization is actually made. Not in moments of pure inspiration and not in boardrooms either, but in the space between those things where beauty and power have always and will always find each other.